There is a small island in the Baltic Sea where the most recognizable sign of identity is not a monument, a skyline, or a flag. It may be a wool skirt with bright vertical stripes worn while someone rides a bicycle, carries groceries, waits near the harbor, or walks across a yard. The sea is never far away. Neither is the mainland, at least on a map. But daily life here has been shaped for generations by the fact that the two are separated by water. For much of its history, men from this community spent long periods at sea, fishing, hunting seals, or working aboard ships. Life on land continued without them. Farms had to be managed, children had to be raised, houses had to be maintained, weddings, funerals, songs, dances, and the rhythm of the household still had to go on. That responsibility fell largely to women. This is Kihnu, an Estonian island with a community of about 700 people. Its cultural space is recognized by UNESCO, and women have played a central role in keeping many of its traditions alive. But Kihnu is not a museum village, and it is not simply an island run by women. It is a modern European community where old practices still survive because people continue to use them. To understand how people live here, it helps to begin where almost every journey to the island begins at the water. The regular ferry from Mainland takes about an hour. In summer, passengers can sit outside and watch the low coast of Estonia recede. In colder months, the same route can become a very different journey. The ferry operates throughout the year and can continue through icy conditions when winter closes over parts of the sea. Arrival is simple. There is no dramatic city gate. The harbor opens onto small roads, low houses, fields, patches of pine forest, and the movements of a community where distances are short enough that cycling is practical. Visitors may notice a sidecar motorcycle, a vehicle that has become closely associated with the island, but for residents, the important part is not the novelty. It is mobility on a small piece of land where the harbor, home, school, shop, and workplace are all part of the same compact geography. The island has 4 villages, but daily life does not feel divided into 4 separate worlds. Roads connect farms, homes, cultural spaces, the harbor, the lighthouse, and the places where people meet. A trip across Kihnu is measured in minutes rather than hours. That small scale changes the social rhythm. People encounter one another repeatedly. Family, work culture, and community are not always separate compartments. Watch the harbor for a few minutes, and the island scale becomes easier to understand. A ferry arrival briefly concentrates movement in one place. Passengers step ashore, bicycles are collected, vehicles roll away, and supplies begin moving toward homes and businesses. Then, the harbor quiets again. The same road that carries a visitor toward the lighthouse may carry a resident toward a shop, a family member's house, or the next job of the day. There is no need to invent a dramatic island routine here. The routine is visible in practical choices. People combine short distances with a dependence on one major link to the mainland. They know when the ferry comes. They know which businesses are seasonal. They know which errands can be handled locally and which require leaving the island. That knowledge is part of living on Kihnu just as much as any song or garment. On a larger mainland tradition can be something scheduled for a festival weekend. Here, it can appear in the middle of an ordinary day. A woman may be wearing a striped wool skirt while checking her phone. Another may be knitting while talking with neighbors. Musicians can arrive at a gathering, put down their belongings, pick up an accordion or violin, and join the music. These details matter because they show what makes Kihnu unusual. The old and the modern are not arranged on opposite sides of the island. They occupy the same yards, the same kitchens, and often the same person. Family life is one of the places where that continuity is most visible. For generations, the division of work created by the sea gave Kihnu women an unusually broad range of responsibilities. Men were essential to maritime work and to the income and connections that came from it. But when they were away, women maintained daily life on land. They farmed, managed households, cared for children, organized important family events, and carried cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. This history is one reason outsiders often describe Kihnu as a matriarchy. The label is catchy, but it is too simple. Local voices have described the community more accurately as matrifocal women are highly visible at the center of household and cultural life, while traditional roles performed by men have also been important to the island's survival. That distinction changes the story. Kihnu is not interesting because one gender supposedly rules the other. It is interesting because geography created a practical division of responsibility, and that responsibility gave women an unusually important role in protecting the social and cultural memory of the island. You can see that memory in material things. A skirt is not only clothing. A pair of mittens is not only protection from the cold. A song is not only entertainment. In Kihnu, these things can carry information about family status, mourning, celebration, and belonging. They are part of a language that people learn by living inside the community. The most visible example is the Kört, the striped wool skirt associated with Kihnu women. Its colors and patterns are not random decoration. Different versions are connected with different circumstances in life, and the knowledge of how to weave and wear these garments has been handed down through generations. The contrast with modern life can be surprisingly direct. Traditional fabric may be worn with contemporary shoes. A handmade skirt can appear beside a smartphone. Materials and influences once brought back across the sea can now reach the island through modern transport and delivery. The method of connection has changed, but Kihnu has never been completely sealed from the outside world. Seafaring itself brought outside influences to the island long before digital technology did. This is an important part of why the culture has lasted. Preservation here does not mean preventing change. It means deciding what can change without losing the meaning underneath. The clothing itself shows how precise that knowledge can be. Kihnu folk dress is not one fixed uniform. Everyday garments, festive clothing, aprons, scarves, sweaters, mittens, and skirts can carry different meanings and be used in different situations. Some of the patterns and colors are understood locally in ways that a visitor would never decode from a photograph alone. That is why the strongest cultural scenes are not the ones that simply place people in colorful clothes against a beautiful background. The stronger scenes show use hands working. A loom yarn pulled tight, a skirt being put on before an event, musician settling into place, someone knitting while listening to conversation, or a child learning a movement from an older person. The process matters because it reveals the labor inside heritage. A finished skirt is visually striking, but it represents hours of weaving and knowledge of pattern. A dance may last only minutes, but it depends on memory and repeated practice. Cultural continuity is built from this slow work long before anybody arrives with a camera. UNESCO recognizes the Kihnu cultural space for a wider system of living traditions that includes songs, games, dances, wedding customs, handicrafts, and the relationship between the community and its landscape. Women became principal custodians of many of these practices because they were the people who remained on the island while men were frequently at sea. One of the oldest layers is found in singing. Kihnu is known for runic or Kalevala meter song traditions with pre-Christian roots. These songs were not created for a stage. Singing has been woven into collective work celebrations, religious life, and major moments in the community. That difference is easy to miss when tradition is filmed only during a performance. A dance can look like a show. A striped skirt can look like a costume. But the meaning becomes clearer when the camera stays after the performance ends. People continue talking, knitting, preparing food, cleaning up, driving home, or arranging the next gathering. Culture does not disappear when the audience leaves. It also survives through repetition. Knitting needles move through wool again and again. Patterns are learned, corrected, and repeated. Dances are practiced. Songs are remembered through singing. Children hear the local language around them and learn forms that may not be common on the mainland. Skills survive not because somebody recorded them once, but because somebody still needs to know how to do them. And this is where Kihnu's UNESCO recognition can be misunderstood. UNESCO does not place the island behind glass. The recognition is for intangible heritage practices and knowledge that only remain alive when people keep performing, teaching, adapting, and using them. On Kihnu, that work of transmission happens inside homes, community spaces, school activities, camps, celebrations, and ordinary conversations. The sea, however, is still the force that explains much of the island's working life. Historically, fishing and seal hunting drew men away from home for long periods. Today, the economic picture is broader. Some islanders still work with fishing and maritime trades. Some work aboard ships or on the mainland. Tourism creates seasonal income through accommodation, guiding food crafts events and local services. Households may combine more than one kind of work across the year. That pattern makes sense on a small island. A community of this size cannot support every service or profession in the same way a city can. Work often has to connect the island to a larger economy. At the fisherman's harbor, the link between culture and geography remains physical. Traditional boats are still used for fishing. In spring, people prepare boats and fishing gear for the season. Engines, ropes, traps, weather, and the condition of the sea turn the Baltic from scenery into a workplace. A fish caught in the surrounding waters can move quickly into another part of island life. It may be cleaned, smoked, cooked, sold, or shared as part of a meal. The distance from sea to table can be short, but modern work is not limited to traditional occupations. A guide may spend the day explaining local customs to visitors. A craft maker can sell woolen goods. A family may provide accommodation or prepare meals during the summer season. A resident may travel to the mainland when work requires it. Kihnu belongs to contemporary Estonia, and its economy is tied to the same phones, payments, transport systems, and online communication found elsewhere in the country. The difference is scale. When a summer event brings visitors, the effect is visible. Cafes and temporary food stops become busier. Handicrafts move from home production into small markets. Local guides have more work. Ferries fill. The island's roads carry more bicycles and vehicles. When the season quiets, some of that activity contracts. Many cafes operate mainly in summer, and colder months bring fewer visitors. The island returns to a more local rhythm. Small island work also tends to overlap. The same person may not fit neatly into one job title throughout the year. A resident can be connected to craft work, tourism, transport, fishing, property maintenance, or community events at different times. That flexibility is practical in a place where the local market is small and the seasons change demand. Summer makes the overlap easy to see. A house can receive guests. A yard can become part of a home-café event. A craft made through winter can be sold when visitor numbers rise. A musician may perform at a festival and return the next day to ordinary work. Local culture therefore supports parts of the economy, but the economy can also place pressure on culture to remain visible and marketable. The island has to earn a living without turning every private skill into a public attraction. That line is constantly negotiated by the people who actually live here. This seasonal change creates an opportunity and attention. Tourism can provide income for skills that are deeply connected to Kihnu identity. Knitting, weaving, food, music, and guiding all have value in a visitor economy. At the same time, culture can lose meaning if it is reduced to a product performed only for outsiders. For Kihnu, the challenge is not simply to attract people. It is to keep local life in control of what visitors come to see. That requires boundaries. A home is still a home. A ceremony is not automatically a tourist attraction. Traditional clothing has meanings that go beyond photographs. The island's landscape is not an empty background for holiday development. This balance between livelihood and cultural ownership is one of the practical questions facing the community today. The same balance appears in everyday living conditions. Kihnu is small, but it is not cut off from modern infrastructure. There are shops, roads, internet access, public services, accommodation, and regular ferry connections. Everyday goods that cannot be produced locally arrive from the mainland. Residents can travel for services, work, education, or shopping that the island cannot provide on its own. That means the ferry is more than transportation for tourists. It is part of the island's basic connection to the rest of Estonia. A missed or delayed journey matters differently when there is no bridge. Weather, ice, wind, and ferry schedules can affect how people plan. The sea does not make modern life impossible, but it adds another calculation to it. On the island itself, the distances are manageable. Cycling is one of the easiest ways to move around Kihnu. Cars and motorcycles are also part of daily life, and the sidecar motorcycle has become one of the island's most recognizable images. Homes sit within a landscape of fields, woodland, and coast, rather than dense urban development. Gardens can provide vegetables and other produce. Food, fuel, building materials, and manufactured goods still depend partly on outside supply, but household production remains visible in ways that are less common in a city. For residents, convenience is also measured differently. A large supermarket, university, specialized workplace, or specialist service is not simply across town. Some needs belong to the mainland. That does not make Kihnu unlivable. It means that mobility has to be planned. The advantage is that the island itself is compact. Many everyday trips are short, and the physical environment remains close. A child can grow up with the harbor, fields, forest, and coastline as ordinary surroundings rather than weekend destinations. A family can maintain a garden beside a modern home. A resident can use fast communications and still depend on a ferry timetable. That mixture is more accurate than the idea of a community choosing between traditional and modern life. Kihnu uses both because both are useful. This is where the idea of traditional life becomes more concrete. It is not a rejection of convenience. It is knowing how to combine what arrives by ferry with what can still be made, grown, repaired, woven, baked, or prepared at home. Food makes that combination easy to see. On an island surrounded by the Baltic, fish has a natural place in the kitchen. Herring and other local catches appear in food events, cafes, and household cooking. Smoked fish is one of the simplest expressions of Kihnu's geography. Catch from the sea, smoke bread, and a meal shared close to where the ingredients were prepared. Bread carries another layer of household knowledge. Women still bake bread at home, and family recipes can vary. Local descriptions of Kihnu food also show that certain meals remain connected to particular days of the week. Saturday can bring mashed potatoes and warm bread from the oven. Wednesday is associated with mash, and Sunday with soup. These are small details, but they reveal something important about how tradition works. It does not always arrive as a major ceremony. Sometimes it is simply the expectation of what should be on the table on a certain day. The kitchen is also where imported and local food meet. Island shops carry staples from the mainland. Gardens can provide produce. Fish comes from the surrounding sea. In summer, cafes and home-based food events expand the choices available to residents and visitors. Local food events show how quickly a domestic practice can become a community one. During Kihnu's Home-Café days, residents open yards and temporary cafes, and people move around the island tasting food while encountering music, crafts, and conversation. The event works because the island is small enough for food, place, and people to remain connected. The island's herring events place the focus not simply on eating fish, but on the skills around it: cleaning, preparing, smoking, cooking, and understanding how a species from the surrounding sea becomes part of the island's seasonal calendar. These events create excellent images for a travel documentary, but their value is not just color and activity. They show the chain from environment to skill, from skill to food, and from food to gathering. That chain is part of daily culture even when no festival is taking place. A meal therefore becomes more than a food segment in a travel film. It connects economy, season, family, geography, and community. There is also work behind it. Fish has to be caught and cleaned. Bread takes time. A garden has to be maintained. Preparing food for a public event requires planning on a scale very different from cooking for a household. When visitors arrive in numbers, these domestic skills can temporarily become part of the island's public economy. But the most revealing food scenes may be the quietest ones: a loaf cooling potatoes being served, fish smoking, someone setting a table, a family eating without ceremony. Those are the moments when Kihnu stops looking like an unusual cultural destination and starts looking like what it is to the people who live here: home. Outside the house, nature is never decorative for long. Kihnu's landscape is low and open, with grassland, pine groves, fields, coastal sand, and the Baltic Sea at the edge of almost every direction. The island's natural and cultural heritage are closely connected. The sea shaped work, the soil shaped farming, wind and winter shaped clothing, buildings, transport, and the practical value of wool. Seasonal change is especially visible. Summer brings long daylight, more visitors, cycling festivals, outdoor gatherings, and a busier harbor. Autumn brings stronger winds and a quieter tourism season. Winter can cover the sea with ice and reduce movement to a more careful rhythm. When ice conditions are strong enough and the authorities declare the route safe, an official ice road can sometimes connect Kihnu with the mainland, temporarily turning frozen sea into a road. It is an unusual form of access, but not something residents can expect every winter. That image is dramatic, but for residents the more important point is routine adaptation. The same journey can require different decisions depending on season. The same harbor can be crowded in July and exposed to cold wind in winter. The same house can be a summer accommodation business and a private family space in the colder months. Nature also sets the pace for work. Fishing depends on conditions. Gardens follow the growing season. Outdoor events are organized around the warmer months. This is why the island's culture cannot be separated from its geography. The songs and skirts may attract attention first, but the conditions that helped shape them are physical cold, wind, sea distance, and a small area of land where cooperation has practical value. Movement across that land tells another part of the story. For a visitor, Kihnu can be explored by bicycle in a day. The island's circular travel wheel route covers about 23 kilometers and passes through its villages, cultural sites, farms, forest roads, and coastal landscape. For residents, these are not attractions arranged on a route. They are pieces of the everyday map. The harbor is the gateway. The school and community spaces help hold social life together. The lighthouse still marks the maritime landscape. Roads connect homes to work and family. A motorcycle or bicycle can cover distances quickly. Then there is the connection beyond the island. Regular ferry service has changed what isolation means. Mobile networks and internet access have changed it again. A person can live inside a culture with ancient song traditions while using a smartphone to organize work, communicate with relatives, follow events, or arrange the practical parts of modern life. That combination is one of the strongest corrections to the idea that Kihnu has somehow been frozen in time. It has not. Modernization has reached the island, but it has not erased every local difference. The important question is which differences remain useful, meaningful, and strong enough to be passed on. A skirt can continue to be worn because it still communicates identity. A song can survive because people still sing it. A ferry makes travel easier, but it does not remove the sea. Internet access expands the world, but it does not automatically replace local relationships. Modern life on Kihnu is therefore not a battle between old and new. It is a continuous negotiation between them. That negotiation becomes most important with the younger generation. A living tradition cannot survive through older people alone. Children have to learn the language, songs, dances, crafts, and the meanings attached to them. On Kihnu, traditional culture is included in education and heritage activities, and camps give young people opportunities to practice skills that might otherwise become occasional performances. At the Kihnu Youth Heritage Camp, Young people connected to the island can learn Kihnu language, make traditional crafts, sing Kihnu songs, dance Kihnu dances, play games, and listen to local stories. These activities may sound like lessons in preservation, but they also create something more basic shared experience among young people whose lives may increasingly extend beyond the island. That matters because small communities are rarely self-contained across an entire lifetime. Education, specialized work, and career opportunities can require time on the mainland or in larger towns. The survival of Kihnu culture does not depend on every young person remaining physically on the island forever. It depends on whether connection continues when people move between Kihnu and the wider world. This changes what cultural transmission looks like. A child can learn a traditional dance and also use social media. A young musician can study elsewhere and return for a gathering. A family with Kihnu roots can participate in a heritage camp during school break. Technology can expose young people to global culture, but it can also help them stay connected to local events, relatives' music, and language. The island's cultural calendar gives younger people places to use what they learn. Youth heritage and music activities are not designed only to archive old material. They create situations where songs are sung with other people, dances require partners, and language becomes something spoken rather than displayed. This distinction is important. A child may know that a skirt belongs to Kihnu, but cultural ownership becomes stronger when that child understands when it is worn, how it is made, what its colors can mean, and why relatives care about it. The same is true for music. Hearing a tune is different from learning to play it in a community where several generations recognize it. For a small community, these moments create continuity across distance. Young people who spend part of their lives elsewhere can still return to a cultural system they understand from the inside. The future of Kihnu is therefore not likely to look exactly like its past. It does not need to. The more important question is whether the next generation sees these traditions as something that belongs to them rather than something they are asked to perform for somebody else. The answer is easiest to see when the island gathers. Kihnu has a calendar of community events built around food, music, dance, maritime life seasons, and local customs. The largest can bring visitors from outside, but the social function goes deeper than tourism. At village and traditional gatherings, music begins. Violins, accordions, songs, and dance bring people into the same space. Children can watch, join, move away, and return. People talk over food. Older residents see familiar patterns repeated by younger ones. Events on the island bring together crafts, food games, performances, concerts, and dancing. Others focus more specifically on traditional dance music, herring home cooking, or seasonal customs. These gatherings provide something daily routines cannot always provide: concentration. Work is set aside for a few hours. People who have been apart occupy the same space. Skills that are usually practiced in homes become shared. Children see that the culture they are learning is not only part of a lesson, it can also be fun. That may be one of the most important forms of preservation on the island. Tradition survives more easily when it is connected not only to obligation, but to music, food, friendship, movement, and pleasure. Kihnu's story, however, is not only about successful preservation. UNESCO has also identified pressures on the cultural space, including economic difficulty, development, and tourism that can be insensitive to local traditions and the natural environment. Those concerns are especially important on a small island because change does not have to be large to be visible. A new building can alter a landscape that has remained open for generations. A rise in visitor numbers can create income, but also change the purpose of a cultural event. A craft made for family use can become merchandise. A song once sung inside community life can become something performed mainly on schedule. None of these changes is automatically harmful. The problem begins when outside demand becomes more powerful than local meaning. There are also the ordinary constraints of scale. A community of about 700 people cannot provide the same labor market services, education, or commercial variety as a large town. Some work happens away from the island. Some services require travel. The tourism economy is seasonal. The sea remains a physical boundary, even when ferries and communications make crossing it easier. There is another pressure that comes from success itself. The more recognizable Kihnu becomes, the easier it is for outsiders to simplify it. A photograph of striped skirts can become shorthand for the entire island. A story about women can erase the work of men. A festival image can make it seem as if people live in ceremonial clothing every hour of the day. For residents, representation matters, because tourism and media can influence what visitors expect to find. If the island is treated as a performance, the most photogenic parts of culture can receive attention, while the less visible work of language, family care, maintenance, fishing, teaching, and community organization remains outside the frame. A responsible travel documentary has to resist that distortion. The goal is not to make Kihnu look more exotic than it is. The goal is to show why ordinary life here has produced something genuinely distinctive, and preservation itself requires labor. Someone has to teach the language. Someone has to organize the camp. Someone has to remember the songs. Someone has to weave the skirt correctly. Someone has to explain why a custom matters. Someone has to decide what can be shared with visitors and what should remain inside the community. That work is often less visible than a festival. It happens in preparation, repetition, correction, and time. This is also why describing Kihnu as simply Europe's last matriarchy can weaken the real story. It turns a complex system of work, gender roles, maritime history, and cultural responsibility into a headline. Kihnu's women do hold an exceptional place in the survival of the island's traditions. That is real. But the culture also depends on men, children, families, fishermen, musicians, teachers, craft makers, guides, ferry crews, and people whose relationship with the island continues even when they work or study elsewhere. A living culture is carried by a community. What keeps people connected to Kihnu is difficult to reduce to a single reason, but the island offers clues everywhere. It is in the practical familiarity of a short road between home and harbor. It is in knowing the wind before a journey. It is in a skirt whose colors carry information that outsiders may not notice. It is in a bread recipe that belongs to a household, a fish smoked in a familiar way, a song whose words have been repeated longer than anyone alive can remember, and a dance that still makes sense when the formal performance is over. It is also in recognition. On an island, this small people are not anonymous in the way they can be in a city. The community can be demanding for exactly the same reason. It can be supportive, people know one another, remember one another, and notice change. That closeness has helped traditions survive, but it also means that preserving Kihnu is not an abstract project. It happens between people. When a woman teaches a younger person how to knit a pattern, the transmission is not happening between heritage and the future. It is happening between two people. When musicians play at a gathering, the audience may include relatives, neighbors, children, and visitors all at once. When the ferry leaves, the island does not become isolated in the old sense. Phones still work. Roads still connect to the harbor. The mainland remains reachable. But the water is still there, and it continues to mark the boundary of a place with its own pace and memory. Perhaps that is why Kihnu has managed to remain distinctive without remaining unchanged. It has always had to live with connection and separation at the same time. From a distance, Kihnu can be reduced to an easy image: a tiny Baltic island, women in striped skirts, fishing boats, folk music, UNESCO recognition. Up close, the picture is more useful. There are about 700 people trying to make ordinary life work on a small island in modern Estonia. They use ferries, phones, cars, shops, schools, and online services. They work at sea, on land, on the mainland, and in tourism. Children grow up with many of the same global influences found elsewhere in Europe. And alongside all of that old skills, still have a practical social life. Women continue to carry a remarkable share of that cultural knowledge, just as generations before them did when men spent long periods at sea. But the reason Kihnu matters is not that time stopped here. It is that time continued and the culture continued with it. A tradition survives when it can leave the museum case and return to the kitchen, the road, the school, the harbor, the dance floor, and the everyday choices of the people who inherit it. On Kihnu, that process is still visible. And as long as the island's culture remains something people live, rather than something they only remember, those roughly 700 residents are carrying far more than the history of a small place in the Baltic. They are carrying a way of belonging. If you enjoyed seeing how everyday life can preserve a place in ways that monuments cannot, continue with another journey in our 4K travel documentary series.